IFRS 16 leases, journal entries for the initial recognition of the right of use asset and the lease liability. We will now look at class example 10, which would indicate all the necessary journal entries required for the initial recognition of the right of use asset and the lease liability. The information provided in class example 6 regarding the right of use asset and class example 9 regarding the lease liability related to Rocco Limited will be used for purposes of illustrating these journal entries. Please refer back to those examples for purposes of getting the relevant amounts. So the required portion is prepare the journal entries in the books of Rocco Limited for all the transactions entered into by Rocco Limited related to the initial recognition of the lease contract in accordance with IFRS 16. So we will now only look at the journals at initial recognition date. The first journal entry relates to the lease incentive paid by the lessor. The lessor paid an amount of $15,000 to Rocco Limited, and because the amount was already paid, bank was debited and the right of use asset was reduced by the 15,000 rand. Please note the appropriate journal entries: right of use asset, office building, and always remember to indicate the relevant section of the financial statements influenced by the journal entry. The second journal entry is the recognition of the right of use asset at the initial measurement of the lease liability. Remember, the initial measurement of the lease liability is the first amount that's included in the cost price of the right of use asset. So the right of use asset is debited and you recognize a corresponding lease liability, and that would be at the present value of the lease payments, as we have determined that in a previous example. The next journal entry looks at the lease deposit that was paid by Rocco Limited. It was an amount paid, so bank was credited, and it increased the cost price of the right of use asset. So the right of use asset increased by the 250,000 rand. The next journal entry looks at the right of use asset that was increased by the initial measurement of the restoration cost provision. Remember, we had to calculate the present value of that restoration costs, and similar to the principle in IFRS 16, the present value was debited to the right of use asset and a corresponding provision was recognized in the SFP. The next journal entry relates to the fees, the incremental fees paid to the external legal advisors by the lessee. So this was the incremental costs incurred by the lessee. The fees was included in the cost price of the right of use asset, the 20,000 rand, and because it was already paid, we credited bank. But the lessor, Memo Limited in this example, reimbursed some of these legal fees to Rocco Limited, and that is treated in the same way as a lease incentive, whereby the right of use asset is decreased with this reimbursement of legal fees. The amount was really received by Rocco Limited, therefore we have a debit entry to bank for the money received. This is all the journal entries that is applicable to the initial measurement of the right of use asset and the lease liability in this example.